Something's fuzzy.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotello, and special guest host this week, Mike Lano. Thank you for joining us this week, Mike. There's lots to talk about in wrestling this week, and certainly what we want to focus on this week is the unfortunate passing of Jim Crockett Jr., and I know you have a lot of stories about him, but we also want to let the audience know that we don't have Evan again this week. He's still working on just putting the very final touches on his book, and we're all looking forward to when he can rejoin us when that book is ready to go. So I know he even has a few of your pictures in his upcoming book.
A lot of pictures. What a book that's going to be. And some are Dave Brzezinski's pictures, and but hopefully I think I have the majority. But it's going to be quite the story. Evan's had one of those only in wrestling lives where music business and adult film business his mom did some work in, and so many things. But the movie, of course, The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke, and oh gosh, Evan put out a newsletter perhaps longer than anybody else. I think it was like 30 years of wrestling then and now, and all of the stuff that he's been doing. I mean, we did Legends Radio for, I don't know, like 18 years, something like that.
And also a lot of the people that were in his life that, are no longer around. And, that's the unfortunate thing that we're going to talk about tonight, and something that keeps becoming a repeat story in our business, which is how people are gone.
It's not just Jim Crockett Jr., who it was kind of poignant that they had the match in AEW Wednesday night with J.J. Dillon coming out. Nobody's seen him. I've been talking to him regularly. But J.J. Dillon came out with Tully Blanchard in that 6-man, and Tully had the United States 10 pounds of silver belt, not 10 pounds of gold. That was the NWA title, but the Mid-Atlantic Charlotte Jim Crockett Jr. promotion, particularly when they took over the time slot at WTBS, Ted Turner's in '85 after Black Friday and all those problems of replacing the fantastic Georgia Championship Wrestling with a subpar, inferior WWF TV product. The fans didn't like it.
Right? Didn't that last only like a couple months or something? It
wasn't bad, but you had to know that
it was the wrong fit. It was like putting on a pair of shoes that was 2 sizes too small. It just didn't feel right to have the WWE or the WWF at that time on Turner.
No, that's a long story that I will get into, but I wanted to say that Jim Crockett Jr., son of Jim Crockett Sr., who had that territory in Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas for ages, and they toured in parts of Virginia, etc. But we also lost former women's world champion Ann Casey, Buddy Colt. These are all people I knew, and I would see them later on. I mean, knew them when they're in their prime. Buddy Colt, who was going to have had, it was either down to he or Bobby Shane. Eddie Graham was going to put the bond on them to become NWA champion, and had suggested them. So those NWA annual Vegas meetings, forget if they were in like August of each year, with Sam Munchnick and all of the NWA promoters. I mean, everybody. Giant Baba would come in. Dusty would come in, depending on, if he was representing Florida or Atlanta office. So Buddy Colt was one of those. And then former Tri-WF World Tag Team Champion with Tony Garea twice, that being Dean Ho. His real name was Dean Higuchi, and he wrestled as that in the Pacific Northwest and in Australia and Japan and other places.
Dean Ho was big in San Francisco.
He was, of course, he was big, right? You're exactly right.
I remember a tag team of him and Peter Maivia, tagging and seeing them. Dean Ho and Peter Maivia. I think they faced the Invaders, or maybe it was the Medics, and that was a hot feud when I was a really young kid.
That's right. It was Invaders. Invaders, managed by a guy who co-hosted my TV show for 7 years, and Gary Kaiser, but the ring name he was using was Gerhard Kaiser, and he got that Gerhard name because that was Roy's second and last TV guy for a good 12 some odd years. Hank Renner, his middle name was Gerhard. So Gary Gerhard Kaiser managed both the Infernos and the oh gosh, interns, but the masked invaders were the ones that you're thinking of. And then Dean Ho this was the period when Roy fired Pat Patterson in '76. And then they first went to, for about a year, as lead babyface Kevin Sullivan, who was just this green kid from Florida by way of Tri-WF. He started, because he's from Boston. So he started working for Vince Sr., went to Florida, brought Bob Roop from Florida, and Barry Orton, Bob Orton Jr.'s brother. But, that was fine for a time. And then they went back to the tried and true lead babyfaces of Dean Ho and Pepper Gomez to a certain extent. And
Pepper Gomez was a big local guy around here, too. He spent a lot of time in Northern California.
Yeah, but he was big around the world. He was WWA World Champion for Dick the Bruiser. He was all kinds of different champions, like North American Champion in Houston for Paul Bosch, legendary promoter. He worked in Dallas. He worked all of the 4 Texas territories. Amarillo for the Funks.
But he's very underappreciated. Pepper Gomez doesn't get a lot of talk. He sort of, Dean Ho doesn't get mentioned very much. Even Peter Maivia.
The wayside. That's the problem. These are people I knew. And at the time, particularly Pepper Gomez was on the cover of Wrestling World. He was on the cover of a 1963 Wrestling Review magazine twice. And that's when it was just the cover photo was one guy, which was huge. So 60s and 70s, even though Pepper Gomez started at LA City College, and he was a football, track and field guy, did some amateur wrestling, but came the way of a pro. And he was main eventing in Los Angeles and San Francisco at the same time, 2 different territories, which was kind of unheard of. Very few people. Roddy Piper did it with Lonnie Main later on, a decade later. But
Pepper was known as the man with the iron stomach, right? Wasn't that
cast iron stomach. They did the angle in '62, one of the greatest San Francisco feuds for Roy Shire of all time, where Pepper would have all these baby faces get up on a ladder and jump onto his stomach to prove that he had a cast iron stomach, and then lead heel Ray Stevens said, "Oh, let me try that," and Pepper reluctantly let him get up there, but instead of just jumping with his feet, he did the knee drop, his famous bombs away knee drop, right onto Pepper's throat, I think it was. They had Pepper, coughing up blood, and it's a great, tremendous angle that was supposed to have sold out Candlestick Park, an outdoor show. They'd already had main events that sold out at the Cow Palace. They were going to do Candlestick Park in '63, and Roy was kind of a daredevil, and he injured himself badly in a motorcycle accident, and that match never happened at Candlestick, where they would have drawn like 35,000 people minimum, probably, maybe 38,000, which was a real shame. But Pepper was a big deal, and then they would rely on him in Los Angeles was my primary home base, shooting ringside for a program. I was one of several photographers, not the only one shooting ringside for the program, but I was the only one also going into the locker room. Like when Terry Funk had just won the NWA title, and like 10 days later came into Los Angeles, I shot a ton of pictures of him with the belt doing everything. And we'll talk about Terry in a little while as it relates to Mid-Atlantic.
Yes.
San Francisco was my secondary home base because I would come up for all the top Roy Shire shows until I moved up there in January '79. But from '73 on, Alan Bolte, who was not only Roy Shire's Cow Palace,
I remember Alan. Yeah, he's the announcer.
Right. He was the ring announcer for Roy Shire, and occasionally when Pepper Martin couldn't do color commentary with Walt Harris and later Hank Renner, Alan would occasionally fill in, maybe once or twice a year, fill in. But he produced the programs from December '73 on, and I was oddly the only photographer shooting ringside, and I was not even local. I was having to fly up, and he would list on the table of contents page, action wrestling program is photographed exclusively by Mike Lano. But it was an amazing program because most programs at that point, like in LA, it was one piece of paper folded like twice. So it had like, say 4 sides to it. It was kind of half-assed. Both these programs would be 20 to 26 pages long, legit pages, so it'd be like 14 pieces of paper, 28 sides. That was as big a program as I'd ever seen. So he had all kinds of stories, and we got a lot of photos in there. But
I
so
really liked Alan. I really liked working with Alan. He was there when I first got to All Pro Wrestling, and he was the All Pro Wrestling announcer. But a little interesting side note: when the boys of APW broke off from All Pro Wrestling, like Modest and Donovan Morgan, and those folks all went over to Pro Wrestling Iron.
well, they formed Pro Wrestling Iron. It was their own
Right.
answer to
They got
no.
my brother. They got my brother to be the announcer. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you'd spent a lot of time with Iron that much to meet my brother, but he was the announcer for Pro Wrestling Iron. And the reason why they chose him over Alan Bolte, even though they really liked Alan, is that unfortunately Alan is such a big guy. He's a tall, dude, and it was awkward to have an announcer that was like maybe sometimes like 6 inches taller than the wrestling talent. And my brother is, I love him, but he's nice and schlubby. He doesn't look, like he's gonna, body slam anybody anytime soon.
What's his work name? What is he?
Oh, Warren Michaels.
He was kind of short and stocky. Was that him?
Yeah, he's like a couple inches taller than I am, and balding. Yeah, I'm sure you've taken a few pictures of him somewhere
I was
down the
there
line.
for all the Iron shows because
Yeah, you were there.
big exits. When those guys left, it was primarily Modest and Donovan's the brains. Frank Murdoch is their primary partner, and
He was the president basically, and ran the day-to-day of Pro Wrestling Iron because Modest and Morgan and Justice and Dilip, they were all in Japan a lot of the time, and so the day-to-day stuff all went to Frank Murdoch, and then they would call me up for business advice and legal advice, because I am a real-life attorney, so I was the kind of the legal staff and sort of business management for Pro Wrestling Iron when Frank Murdoch needed help on stuff like that.
does anybody still talk to Frank? I got to see.
I haven't talked to him in decades. And I would love to have him on the show if we ever can get a hold of him.
A little harder because they're bitter about the business. No, I was covering both APW when they left, and then of course I covered all the Iron shows. And occasionally, here I am shooting ringside, and they would say, "Well, Mike, our ringside announcer didn't show up." They would have me ring announce too. Modest would. So I was there, for example, when she started. The first place I ever saw her. So I don't know if she went through APW's boot camp with Sarah D'Amato, Sarah Del Rey.
Yeah.
She worked as for some reason Roland just had her work with that dumb Nikki. And then she got to use her own name. Well, she was calling herself Sarah Del Rey, but her real name is Sarah D'Amato before she went to WWE's training center, NXT. But in Iron, probably the best match I ever shot or having was against the guy, and that's Nigel McGuinness from Ring of Honor. She worked a match.
That was great. I remember that. Actually, she also had some great matches against Asumi Sakai. I loved those matches. And Cheerleader Melissa. She faced Cheerleader Melissa a lot.
AEW before the whole break happened.
Right.
And later on, when I forget what happened. How many years Iron lasted? It was only about 3.
Yeah, I think we got about 3 years in there, from 2003 to about 2006.
Well, they left in 2001. King of the Indies was like August of 2001, and right after that was when they formed Iron. They completely split. They took a lot of the front office staff, referees, and it was exactly.
It took about a year for them to do their first show. They didn't do a show right away.
They started the school, but it was exactly the same as with Noah was started when all of the All Japan guys. When Bob had died, his wife was kind of a piece of work and would yell and scream at people, and she was very difficult to get along with most people. And they just had enough of her, and she lost their face. So everybody left except for Kawada. He was the only guy that left. I mean, everybody left, even the old-time legends. They went to Noah, which was happening, Misawa's promotion, and then Misawa's promotion, Noah, was utilizing Modest and Donovan and Bison and maybe a guy here and there. But I don't think Max Justice, Mike Diamond ever did Japan.
I don't remember. I do know that they took Seth, who was, Ryan Drago, who then wound up being part of the Vaudevillains. He had his tour in Japan.
Psycho Seth?
Yeah, Psycho Seth or Ryan Drago or
Gorilla, Pro Wrestling Gorilla in L.A. He went down there too.
right. So there was a lot of and then there were some other young talents who were just starting out there, like Rick Luxury, was just getting his start out there too. So there was a lot of nexus.
Rick Luxury, wasn't he trained in Sacramento or Reno, maybe by Big Up, something like that?
Yeah, by the I think over in the Monster Factory that they have, Paul Isadora and the Reno Scum run up there in Reno. But you know how it is too. Like, guys just rotate around. They do, they learn some stuff in Sacramento. They go to Reno. They get trained there. They go to the Bay Area. They get some training here. A lot of people don't understand this about wrestling, that a lot of wrestlers don't always just train in the same spot. They rotate around.
They get finessed. Like if Sarah D'Amato, Sarah Del Rey, did start an APW, then she really finessed and came into her own, and she had even more training and better training at Iron with Modest and Donovan and everybody that taught there. Who were the primary instructors? So we are going to get to our tribute to Jim Crockett Jr. and the other three legends.
Oh, absolutely. But we had a lot of it was Modest was doing a lot of training, and Donovan Morgan was doing a lot of training at Pro Wrestling Iron. And then, Frank Murdoch, when he was there, did do some training as well. And I remember learning a lot from Max Justice when he was at Pro Wrestling Iron. He was a surprisingly good teacher. And another person who, Vinny Massaro was doing a lot of training there. And
at Iron, he was at APW. He stayed
right.
at APW.
He was doing, when he came over there, he did do some assistant training. A lot of it was just sort of like, a lot of the talent that would come through there would also spend a Saturday working with the boys and training. Like, you'd have Christopher Daniels giving some classes to, some of the guys that were there. And we were lucky enough to have, some other guys stop through that were, it was great. We even had one match with Misawa there himself, and the kind of respect that he generated was really amazing. Mark Smith would come back from Japan or his Puerto Rican tours and show guys things that he'd learned and stuff that he picked up from when he was overseas. So there was more of a collectiveness, and there wasn't really so much of like the head trainer and the rigidity of the system that existed in APW. Like, in APW, there was the system that was created by Thompson, not Robert Thompson, but Ricky.
Ricky started it. Ricky was a Roy Shire enhancement talent.
And that sort of like wrestling style was very rigid in APW. You really had to do things the way that it was formed by Ricky and by Roland Alexander. And, if you deviated from that, they weren't very happy. And then, as time moved on and they moved over to Pro Wrestling Iron, it really became more fluid, and it was more trying to adapt to what Noah wanted and the Noah style and that strong Japanese style that then sort of infiltrated. But there wasn't a set of moves that you kind of had to do or know how to do like it was in APW. It was
a hybridized thing. The thing that we were blessed with, APW went through, I don't even know if we could remember and name all the trainers, because initially it was just Ricky Thompson. And then I forget when things changed, because Ricky left after about 4 years, 3-4 years. He was head trainer. It was called Pacifico Sports then. The show end of it was called All Pro Wrestling. And they eventually changed the name to the boot camp, APW boot camp. But I forget if that was like 99, 2000, something like that.
That's right when I joined.
9, yeah. But for example, well, Robert Thompson, he was no relation to Ricky Thompson. He's got a different last name. He became head trainer, but then I think he had quite a few assistant trainers, from Jardy Franz for flying style to Vinny Massaro to Mayock the magician. I forget what that guy's he changed his name to something else.
Jody, I think, or Jordy, or I'm
James Watkins.
Oh, James Watkins. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Gosh, it's been so long.
And but one of the many things, I think the Dilip Singh thing was a precipitating thing. The Brian Ong death hadn't happened yet, but the main thing was they were going to put over and then announce at King of the Indies, which again I think it was August of 2001, that American Dragon, Bryan Danielson, who we now know in WWE as Daniel Bryan, was going to become head trainer. And that just, because he was an outsider, he wasn't from there, and he was from Oregon, and then he went to Texas to train with Shawn Michaels. And I don't know why Roland did that, because he must have known he was going to piss off all of his talent, bringing in an outsider, not only putting him over in King of the Indies over Low-Key in the main event, but you remember Donovan Morgan, for example, had the match with Bryan Danielson, and he pretended he was, injured. They locked up, something happened, or was it Bison Smith?
It was Donovan against Bison, and they were both headed on the way out, and they both knew they were going to have to job to American Dragon, so they decided to double disqualify themselves and have the worst match of their collective careers, both of them, by laying down and having basically a non-competitive match, which should have been a great match, but instead, in fact, a few months earlier, or maybe about 6 months earlier, Mark Smith as Super Destroyer 2000 faced Donovan Morgan in a title match for Donovan Morgan's world title, or the heavyweight championship. And that actually turned out to be one of the best matches I ever saw or managed, period. That was a great one. And so Roland was expecting those two to have the same kind of a match in King of the Indies. And instead, they undersold that match, and they kind of screwed Roland over because they were mad that Roland... Well, there was a whole dynamic there, especially because of the fact that Roland was upset that Donovan and Modest and Bison weren't going to include Roland in the Noah deal. Roland wanted his 10%.
They were taking with them when they formed Iron. They were taking that Noah deal away.
Well, Roland wanted it all to go through APW and get his cut. And I've told this story before, but I'll say it again. When Roland went to meet the Noah executives, okay, the Noah executives came out to meet Roland. They were wearing $1,000 suits, okay? Roland came out wearing a tank top, a baseball hat on backwards, hadn't shaved in like 3 days, looked like he hadn't slept in a week, and was wearing flip-flops and cut off shorts, like those shorts that they were sweats, but they were cut off at the knees, and those were his shorts. And he looked like he hadn't changed anything in like about 3 or 4 days. So he put off an image to the Noah executives of just the kind of thing that they absolutely didn't want to deal with. And so the Noah executives said to Modest and Morgan and Bison, we want you guys, but we don't want to work with this Roland guy. He's just an embarrassment. He looks like such a schlep that we don't want to deal with him. So we'll help you form a new wrestling federation that has ties to Noah, but we don't want to have anything to do with Roland.
Remember at one of the two, what did they call the Halloween shows? Is it Halloween Hell?
Halloween Havoc. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. That's the WCW one.
CW's pay-per-view. Halloween Hell.
Halloween Hell, yes.
Twice I dressed up as Roland. I had the dirty sweats, the tank top, the hat backwards, the dark sunglasses, the Grella Monsoon sunglasses. Even at nighttime you wear the... So, we had this relationship, but I would poke fun at him. And I often told him, you got to dress up when you're meeting these people. And Austin came. I don't even know what the reason that Austin and or Savage came to the school just once briefly. But I said to him, and he never would listen, I go, you have to dress up when WWE people come. If they're looking at some talent, it might have been Mike Lockwood, Crash Holly. I can't remember.
Because I think it was also Spike Dudley.
No, he was Holly. Matt Heisen was Spike Dudley.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, but I think they came to see
Aaron O'Grady, Mike Lockwood. They came to look at him because Matt Heisen was already long gone.
Oh yeah, you're right.
He made it in, and Crash Holly was not politically correct, and he acted like a big stuff, and he went for an ECW tryout, and he so pissed them off they didn't even use him on the show, and he insulted Taz somehow. Sadly, and then he came back and told the whole tale in a shoot interview. He opened up an APW Gym Wars doing his promo on the couch. He'd just come back with his tail between his legs.
I remember that.
It was a real, we were all hoping, hey, this is going to be great for him. But Matt Heisen, who was Spike Dudley and joined the whole Dusty clan, he did much better because he knew how to play the game. And then a little bit later, Vic Grimes, which I don't want to get into. But we can talk more about, one thing cool about Northern California history is Roland did his best to try to work with Jerk White. That's what I call Kirk White.
Yeah, he's never going to be a guest on this program, so you can call him whatever you want.
No, well, he is only about money. Say whatever you want to say about Roland Alexander, and a lot of that personally came out. For example, the Beyond the Mat. I had worked with Barry Blaustein and his money guy, Wrestling Federation, Barry Bloom, as their still image photographer for years, and he filmed matches in LA and a ton in Vegas, the TC Martin stuff. In Vegas, like when Terry Funk would meet Cactus Jack and Sabu in a three-way, and then the promotion, he cheated some people at the Silver Nugget Arena in Vegas, and he had to move it to his hometown of Sacramento, where his sister, who had no wrestling knowledge, he made her the lead heel manager, which was crazy. But anyway, so Blaustein, I invited him to come up to APW. And he had been shooting this pre-production footage. He had no idea where he was going to go. And I may not have been the only one, and I'm not trying to put myself over, but I said, you should try focusing this thing. You're going to be shooting forever. I don't know when you're going to get this done, but you should focus on a wrestler from the past, a legend like Terry Funk, then somebody from today like Mick Foley, then he was Mankind, Cactus Jack, and WWF, and then a superstar from tomorrow. And I suggested either Chris Candido or Mike Modest, and that's why Blaustein came up to look at Mike Modest, and that's Roland spent all that money titting up the Gym Wars, the garage. He had the camouflage that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. He really made it look fantastic, but so in the course of all of that, and then, the legend got changed. I think Terry Funk had a big role, but Jake Roberts was now sort of the aging legend. He went with Mick Foley, and now I'm forgetting who he used as his young talent.
Tony Jones, he featured Tony Jones.
He wasn't the lead young guy of today. He had a great part, and Tony's so well-spoken and, athletic with all the amateur credentials. But Roland came off as such a carny, which he relished. We talked to Tony about that about a month ago. So I don't know. Roland should have dressed up and been, he's going to be in a documentary with Vince McMahon. He knew what he was getting into, and he should have dressed the part. But what I was going to say was, so doing joint shows, he did it twice, APW versus Big Time Wrestling, which was just Kirk White's copycat name. He stole the name Big Time Wrestling. That was the name of Roy Shire's promotion. Where
he never actually earned it from Roy Shire. He never actually bought it from Shire. It just...
He just used it, Roy folded his tent in January of '82. And so how Kirk got started was Woody Farmer had a cable access show down in Newark, and Woody was having problems. It was United Artists Cable before it became Comcast down there. Small studio, but they let him keep a dedicated ring there for these weekly tapings, and Woody was going to try to do something with another cable system. So he gave the time slot in the cable access thing to Kirk White, who was bringing in some names like Reggie Bennett. I suggested her from Japan, and some people like former Glow Lady wrestler who lived in LA, Cheryl Russa, and other folks, Jessica Sato, who played Reggie Bennett's sister for Kirk's little TV thing, and then Reggie got her a gig over in the JWP women's promotion of Japan. So it was fun, and Woody helped him start doing signings. His very first ones were with Greg Valentine and Buddy Rose and Bruce Beefcake. But you know, he never showed any thankfulness. Like when
no, and I will say this about Kirk White. I only performed for him once, and I will say this about Kirk White. Kirk White is one of the few people that I know of that you can have a conversation with him, and he'll be talking to you, and pretty much he is having a completely different conversation than the one you're having with him. Whatever you think you're talking about with Kirk White, he has a completely different view of what you're saying to him. And again, if it doesn't revolve around money and how it turns into profit for him, he doesn't hear a word you are saying.
He doesn't have the passion. He was a mark. He was just a fan. Nothing wrong with that in the day. He didn't even come around until towards the last couple of years of Roy Shire's thing anyway. But a big mark for Shire's wrestling, that's fine. But it was all about money for him. He didn't have the passion that Roland did, or say Rick Bass.
Everything to him is a commodity. Everybody that walks in front of Kirk White is a dollar sign, either a bigger dollar sign or a smaller dollar sign or no dollar sign. And if it's no dollar sign, you have no value whatsoever to Kirk White. If it's not,
I rode with him to some really tiny WWF house shows. One was like, it wasn't Clear Lake, but it was like way up there.
Probably Canocti or something.
Yeah. And one was like Vallejo, something like that. But so we ride up there. He doesn't say anything until we enter the building, and he knows I'm going backstage to get my photographer's credential. There was no TV there. I knew Pat Patterson was there. He or Mick Foley would help me out, get the press thing so I could shoot ringside. But like he knows I'm doing that. I'm busy with that, and he goes, Mike, by the way, see us last minute. Here, I've got about 50 8x10s of Kurt Angle. Can you ask him to sign them for me? And I refused to do it. And so I had heat with him ever since. And then he did his little tiny, sometimes, I mean, they were okay, those little conventions that he did. They were really small, dinky in comparison to big ones, like the one in Mid-Atlantic. I can't think, Greg Price threw fantastic ones at Mid-Atlantic, Charlotte every year, and other great conventions. And these were kind of pathetic at times. They got better a little bit later on. But he asked me to book Pat Patterson for him and do all of this stuff, and then treated me on my pay. He was like running away from me every time at the convention I went up to him. And then that evening, you know, he left early, or he left, you know, immediately when the convention was over, and had his people, his volunteers, clean up. It was a one-day only thing on Saturday. And I call him at home, doesn't answer his phone. I accidentally got him the next morning. I was using my wife's cell phone. I didn't recognize the number. And he picked up, and he goes, and I go, you stiffed me. You owe me, you know. And it was, I ran all of his, I did this several, he asked me to run all of his radio, TV, newspaper. I got him all of this stuff at no cost. So all I was to get paid was $150. And I'm talking, I worked for 3, 4, 5 weeks. I got him stuff in the San Francisco Chronicle. I got him wrestlers where, you know, the lead guys he had, Piper and Bret Hart and some other names, Honky Tonk Man. I got him on ESPN on the Razor and Mr. T's show. And so he stiffs me. But then he says, well, you should have hit me up before you saw me leave last night. You know, this is Sunday morning after the Saturday. And I said, that's bullshit. You were running away from me. You had no intention of changing.
Let's summarize it by saying, when people say they hate wrestling promoters, they're thinking about Kirk White. He's the epitome of why people hate wrestling promoter.
Is a bad name. But in contrast, Rick Bassman, who worked with Roland, they had a UPW versus APW feud.
I remember Rick Bassman and working with him.
UPW was out of Orange County, just south of Los Angeles.
Very professional.
Very professional, because he also had a dojo where he had Tom Howard training MMA superstars from.
Well, that's where we got John Cena from.
Yeah, that was the wrestling part of it. And I shot down there as well for all of his spectaculars. He had a ton of talent, but when Chris Daniels and Frankie Kazarian and Samoa Joe and Keiji Sakota and Melissa, who is engaged to one of the Ballard twins, or girlfriend, longtime girlfriend, they would all come up, and Melissa would manage as cheerleader. Melissa managing. That was the first we ever saw of her managing the Ballard twins. But I saw her do that at UPW, and they had tremendous feuds. And then they were part of those Vallejo shows, which culminated. We had a series of Vallejo shows.
Those were great. Those are the highlights of my wrestling life, pretty much. Those Vallejo shows.
In King of the Indies, and after the 2-night Friday, Saturday night King of the Indies, that was it for Vallejo. Everything was back to the gym. I don't know why we lost. Maybe it was just a 6-month deal.
Well, the place itself closed. The Mare Island sports facility that we were at, they couldn't run it. It was massive. Remember, it was huge, and I don't think they could cover the costs.
It was like, it reminded me, after that happened, I kept suggesting the Palladium in Alameda, which was near me, just outside of Oakland. It was exactly same thing, but it was much closer to where everybody was. Vallejo was kind of far away.
It was close to my house. I loved it. I could be at the show in like 20 minutes. I thought it was great.
Those were all great, house shows and blah, blah, blah. But Bassman had a wealth of talent that he would bring up, and they were all part of King of the Indies, including Spanky Brian Kendrick.
Right.
That he was all part of that thing. Cena never made it up here as prototype, but
no, he did. No, he was up here for 2 matches. We had him for 2 UPW invasions. One at the actual garage, and then the other one was in Vallejo. I worked both of those shows.
Because I shot most all of his matches for UPW down there. He was a heel, and he was part of like 2 other giant tall guys, and him with his bleach blonde mohawk. That was John Cena's prototype. But we probably should get into.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, now that we've bashed Kirk White, let's talk about a different kind of promoter. And so let's bring up the initials, JCP. What do those initials mean to you?
Well, it's Jim Crockett Promotions. But you remember, I was saying earlier at the start of the show. And so we really send our best and regrets and love to the families of Jim Crockett Jr., Women's Champion Ann Casey, Dean Higuchi, and Buddy Colt, all total legends, main eventers. Jim Crockett Jr., though, when he took over for his father, Jim Crockett Sr.'s territory was known in Charlotte and Mid-Atlantic as mostly a tag team. And they had, it was really just about tag teams. You would go and they would have just 3 matches, but they'd be very long, an hour apiece, 45 minutes apiece, tag matches. Rip Hawk and Swede Hansen against, George and Sandy Scott. And
Bob Roop was involved in a lot of them with Bob Roop and Kevin Sullivan.
Not at that period. No. Not at that period. There was Skull Murphy and Brute Bernard. It was just strictly all tag teams. And Penny Banner's husband, I can't think of his name now. But anyway, when Jim Crockett Jr. took over, and I don't even say the year because I'd screw up the year. I can't remember if it was like 74, 75.
Okay, yeah, I'm still a kid. I was still a young kid at that stage.
We're talking about this much later, but when he came in, he wanted to utilize wisely, and not a whole lot of promoters were doing that, all young guys that were up and coming. He brought in Ric Flair from Vern Gagne's school, where Rick had, when he graduated in the 72, 73, with Ricky Steamboat and Bob Bruggers, and I think Sergeant Slaughter and Iron Sheik. They all came into Mid-Atlantic later, but I'm kind of simplifying things, but when he brought in Ric Flair, who was simply jobbing for guys like Chris Taylor and Larry Hennig and the AWA on TV, big fat jobber, he dropped a bunch of weight, he came in, bleached his hair, and then was paired with lookalike Rip Hawk. I don't remember if they were saying he was like a younger nephew of Rip Hawk, but I have the Jim Crockett tape that he gave me, Ric Flair's very first Woo, and he's doing a tag team against, I think it was Rufus R. Jones and Tiger Conway Jr., who he was good friends with, and he does his first Woo, and it was almost, not really, but it was just a tad light racist type of verbiage used in the promo. And then, of course, he brought in Johnny Valentine. So I think Jim Crockett Jr. might have taken over in 74, August, September 74, because Johnny Valentine was promised the book by my main boss in LA, Mike LaBelle, who then rescinded it when Johnny came in, signed all the paperwork, went over and did a tour for Inoki in New Japan. Then he was supposed to come back to LA and main event against John Tolis for the Americas title. But while in Japan, he gets the call from Mike LaBelle saying, I still want you to come in and blah, 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 but I'm just a little uncomfortable giving a book to an outsider. So Johnny told him to F himself, and he went on to Mid-Atlantic to book, and he booked that territory stiff. First thing he told guys, all the old-timers that he decided to keep, and those George Becker and Sandy Scott were another tag team at that period. But he said, I don't want to see any light. I want stiff punches and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to start emphasizing singles wrestling. And so Johnny went with Flair and Valentine, but a lot of legends came in too that were never there before. Bobo Brazil came in, and a little bit later to pass the torch to Flair, George and Sandy Scott, and in tandem with their boss, Jim Crockett Jr., had Buddy Rogers come in around 77, 78 as the real Nature Boy, to pass the baton to Ric Flair. It was a battle of the figure four leg locks because Buddy Rogers had his own figure four before Flair was even born, most likely. But he submitted to Flair and helped put Flair's legend over. And I mean, a plethora of guys came in, tons of talent. When Bob Remus, who he had become in Kansas City, become Sergeant Slaughter.
Yes, Sergeant Slaughter, yes.
Right to Mid-Atlantic. I mean, he just had, just a plethora of great guys. Wahoo McDaniel was there. So Johnny Valentine, but mostly Jim Crockett Jr. giving his trust to George and Sandy Scott, helping with the book, particularly George Scott. So Valentine and then George and Sandy Scott just elevated that territory, and it was one of the hottest on the planet. And then, of course, when Georgia Championship Wrestling, the second incarnation, Ole Anderson's baby, it was moved to like 4 a.m, 5 a.m, a horrific time slot. And then Ole's partners, Jack and Jerry Briscoe and Jim Barnett, threw their weight behind. I'm simplifying this, so there's a lot more to the story. Their weight to Vince, and that's how Vince. So they switched over, did a heel turn on Ole, went to Vince McMahon, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, and Jim Barnett, who was a legendary promoter and brain in the business and booker. That's how Vince got Black Saturday. He got the TV show. People were ready for Georgia Championship Wrestling, which was not the same as the first incarnation, even though Gordon Soley was still doing the commentary, Ole the booking, and one of the lead faces with Thunderbolt Patterson. But they turn it on and they see this WWF program, I guess it was the Superstars, WWF Superstars, and they were extremely unhappy. But that had its reign, and then Ted Turner, who loved and supported wrestling, because that's what put WTBS on the map as a superstation in 77, way ahead of WGN in Chicago, that Jim Crockett, I forget how that deal came about, but NWA Wrestling returned with Jim Crockett Jr. Promotions replacing, I remember that very first episode like it was yesterday, replacing WWF's programming, and it was a big hit because you had Flair and new faces, the Georgia fans, and also people around the country that were watching Superstation, hadn't seen these guys before. J.J. Dillon managing first Buddy Landell, and then Tully Blanchard, and later the formation of the Four Horsemen, the Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express. Jim Cornette is a fantastic, incredible manager. Paul Jones is a manager, the Powers of Pain.
Paul Heyman, even back then.
later on, not at the
Yeah.
beginning, not until about 1990 did Heyman come in, and or maybe 89, and then they did the Battle of the Midnight Express because Heyman brought in
Yeah, the other Midnight Express.
Midnight Express. Jim Cornette already at that point had the second incarnation of Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane, Sweet Stan Lane. And that was fantastic. That was
so you met Jim Crockett Jr. What was
for times he allowed me when he would come into LA or San Francisco. LA, it was the Bill Graham Civic for his NWA Jim Crockett Promotions house shows. In LA, it was down at the Fabulous Forum. No, he would give me access, gave me a press pass. I just had to ask him. But I posed him with Ric Flair, with Dusty Rhodes and the Road Warriors with their 6-man titles. I posed him with Paul Jones and Rick Rude. But, got to talk to him. He was impressed that I knew all about his dad and the transition from the tag team territory of his father to what he was doing, making it hip and happening. And, of course, the 1983, I was actually it was the first supercard wrestling pay-per-view. It wasn't the first closed circuit. That would be in Los Angeles in 71 for all the Mike Lavelle, Blassie Tola shows, etc. But Starrcade 83, December of 83, with Flair, Harley Race, Flair for the Gold, with I think it was Kiniski as referee, Gene Kiniski, and tremendous card, Piper, Valentine, and the dog collar, and all of that great stuff. He had it way before WrestleMania. And, Jim Crockett Jr. Lasted a good 4+ years with Ted Turner. And then, they bought him out when he was having problems. But I remember the different periods because I would fly all over the country to shoot Bill Watts' UWF tapings. That was what had morphed from Mid-South, and then it became the syndicated TV program, UWF of Watts. And if I'm right on the timing, it's not one way or the other. Crockett kind of overspent to buy out Bill Watts, UWF, and then later it wasn't Eddie Graham's anymore because he sadly died, but the Florida Championship Wrestling, and bought that out, but then didn't take their champions and like pair them champion against champion. Like they should have taken Watts, UWF World Champion Steve Williams, and put him against, say, Flair or Wyndham or something like that, instead of having him. He was in the main event for UWF, incredible, fantastic world champion, Japan legend. And then when Crockett bought him, Watts out, they have the champion, Steve Williams, in opening matches on pay-per-views. And it was embarrassing.
Yeah, it was really too bad. I really loved the UWF.
They were it was incredible. The Freebirds and One Man Gang.
One Man Gang was a big guy then, and they had
Eddie Gilbert and Terry Taylor. Eddie Gilbert was a booking genius, and he was learning at the feet of Watts. So he could have, had he not died.
Didn't they have early versions of Sting and the Ultimate Warrior in UWF?
Yeah. Then later they had Sting was part of Hot Stuff Incorporated. Eddie Gilbert's family with Rick Steiner. He was a heel, and then eventually turned face. But, there's all that transition stuff, and they tried mixing it up. And so I shot a couple of the joint, before they fully closed down UWF. It was kind of a mishmash of UWF and NWA wrestlers, but it was called a UWF taping. So they're in the process of buying it. And, they brought in guys that had not worked for Watts before, like Dick Murdoch, and so a lot of the talent were dropping to these NWA guys that were strictly Jim Crockett guys. So that's when, in 89, when Ted Turner officially bought out Jim Crockett and had Eddie Gilbert as booker, and immediately Eddie brought in Ricky Steamboat from WWF, and that culminated in
it was huge.
2 to 3 fantastic pay-per-views that were all 5-star. Flair Steamboat that everybody raved about, and then Flair versus Flair turns face against Terry Funk, which was an absolutely incredible series, and Luger and was it Luger and Steamboat on the undercard of that, and Gary Hart would come in later. But anyway, Mid-Atlantic, you think of so many guys and really going super national. I mean, Ole Anderson with his Georgia Championship Wrestling I think they changed the name a bit because they changed the name of the, just the Atlanta and Georgia titles to the national title. That became the top singles title for Ole. But Jim Crockett, when he took that slot over, there wasn't a smooth transition because Vince was in the middle of Ole to Vince to Jim Crockett. But Jim had already been promoting at Mid-Atlantic successfully, and they were doing towns outside of North Carolina, parts of South Carolina, Virginia, etc. And one of the great promoters. He made some trips to Japan with Flair. I have some great stories. Crockett told me of how he bailed out. Ric Flair, allegedly, according to Jim Crockett, had filed for bankruptcy. He kept overspending and was renting private planes and stuff. So Jim Crockett, when I was at a show and I had to go pick him up at the airport, I picked up Flair and Ken Patera. They had come in on Jim Crockett's private plane. And, this was after the accident and stuff. So Flair was, he was a little bit nervous about riding in that plane, because he'd had, I think it was like a 14, 15 months of recuperation from that accident.
Broken back or something, right?
It paralyzed Johnny Valentine. And but a lot of different stories. Jim was a real studious guy, and I remember talking to him later, and he just really reamed Jim Hurd, who was the guy in '91 that Ted Turner was trying to put bureaucratic guys who had no experience, no passion.
And who brought us the Shockmaster, I think. He's the
Jim Hurd did
the Shockmaster.
He was there the infamous night at the Tampa Sportatorium, not the Dallas Sportatorium, but the Tampa one, for it was I think it was the Flair Fujinami rematch. But that's the night at that pay-per-view where the Oz angle happened, where Kevin Sullivan played Kevin Nash was Oz.
Right.
Dorothy, they had all these people dressed up as the Wizard of Oz people, but Kevin Sullivan had all this makeup on, and he had a monkey on his shoulder, which ended up biting him, and he needed stitches later. He said that was the most effed up angle he was ever a part of. Jim Hurd also had these great ideas that Jim Crockett would tell me were insane. Jim Crockett was the first guy to tell me Jim Hurd's experience was as an ice cream man. But Jim Hurd wanted this wrestler he was going to call Quasimodo, the hunchback.
Right, that you couldn't pin because he had a humpback.
Yeah, that was, the brilliance. The Oz thing was like one and done. It was a one pay-per-view. He also actually came up with the stupid thing he pushed on Dusty, Johnny B. Bad, for Mark Marrow, and it actually kind of took. He was initially a heel managed by Teddy Long.
Right.
And it actually went, and fans, enjoyed it. So we only have a few minutes left. I was going to leave at this point, but I wanted to say Ann Casey. Ann Casey was so Jim Crockett Jr., legendary promoter. The boys loved and respected him. Not on the level of like Paul Bosch or Sam Munchnick or.
I did want to know what you feel his lasting legacy is before we move on. What do you think?
Excellent matches and revitalizing the industry. But let me get into Ann Casey. Was a world champion wrestler who was not part of Moolah's school, and she would, although she would battle Moolah in matches I shot in California in 1970 and 71. I mean, she wrestled all over the place. She was one of those few indies like Vivian Vachon, Paul and Maurice Butcher and Mad Dog's sister, Vivian Vachon and Kay Noble and Jean Anton and Betty Nicolai and Cherie Dupree. There was quite a few Heather Feather indie wrestlers who were not part of Moolah's school or promotion or anything like that, and they were still excelled. And Ann Casey was at a Cauliflower Alley, as was Buddy Colt, as was Jim Crockett Jr. at our Tampa ancillary one, and then Dean Ho. Dean Ho, great memories of him. What a gentleman. He was always at the Seattle wrestler reunion events at Dean Silverstone's house. And, just could pick his brain about like Lonnie Moondog Main stories. He also teamed with him for Roy Shire's promotion. Dean was U.S. champion, and he had some battles. He had a Harley race and a title defense. So this is Dean Ho. At the Cow Palace. He had a huge feud with the heel Don Morocco. And then finally, Buddy Colt. This guy was Mr. Florida. He had held all the tag titles for Eddie Graham in Florida. That was his primary base. He was geared, as was Bobby Shane, at the exact same time. One of them was going to be NWA champion, but Bobby Shane died in that separate plane accident a couple of months either before or after the Ric Flair Johnny Valentine one. And I got to shoot one of Bobby Shane's very last matches. Buddy Colt had sent him to All Japan, and he was either going or coming from All Japan. He came into our LA territory and had just 2 matches for our TV. But one was a dream 10-minute draw. Nobody even LA knew Bobby Shane. Bobby the Shane, the King. He would come to the ring a la Ernie Ladd with a crown, way before Lawler ever did it, or Harley Race. And just fantastic, colorful person, as was Buddy Colt. But Buddy Colt was in the Florida accident, the one that took Bobby Shane's life, his best friend, and he was never the same. He had to retire because he was all paralyzed and messed up, as was Johnny Valentine, and became a color commentator, a babyface with Gordon Solie. Prior to that, he was one of the greatest heels ever. So we lost Jim Crockett Jr. and Casey, Dean, Ho, real last name Higuchi, Dean Higuchi, and Buddy Colt, all incredible talents this week. AEW pay-per-view is tomorrow, and at Sushi Onita's creation, the exploding barbed wire death match.
Oh man, am I glad I've retired from doing anything in the ring. That you see those kind of matches, you're like, I'm glad I never wanted to be involved in anything like that.
Well, I urge people, if you're interested or whatever, they do have on their YouTube channel, AEW tomorrow, I think it's at 3 Pacific, they have the buy-in show. It's a women's tag, so you can get a little taste of AEW. But that's tonight is UFC. I don't know how AEW, why you want to book a pay-per-view after the day after Ultimate Fight pay-per-view, because your audience may not have enough money.
It's not exactly the same audience. It's a little different.
A lot of MMA fans love pro wrestling.
We'll see what their buy rates are. We'll see what their buy rates are like.
Well, they're doing well. And the other big news story is it's not been made official, but NXT is going to move from having the same time slot Wednesday nights as AEW, which is insane. And they did that just to screw with AEW when it debuted. So they're going to move.
It didn't work.
Nope. They've never beaten them in the ratings, maybe once. But AEW really, its ratings we'll see. I mean, it might even eclipse Raw. Raw's ratings and shows have been so horrible, whereas AEW's have held steady and risen. And it's a more Japan-like product. They don't start the show with big, long promos. They get right into the matches.
It's fun. I've enjoyed it so much more. And I know that the NWA is starting to come back, too. So, there's some serious...
So I might try to bring on here. I had him on for an hour and a half with me and Evan when he was just getting his feet wet with TNA. But he has always loved wrestling, sort of like David Arquette, these big, massive celebrities. What a nice guy, very honest. He's been fine with talent like Thunder Rosa going to AEW. Didn't sign him to big long-term contracts. But, we have all of this stuff going on. We've got Championship Wrestling from Hollywood on Sinclair stations, a la Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor is one of the best TV shows you have ever seen. And you can go right to their website and watch their weekly TV. They're filming without crowds. Everybody's trying to do their best.
But the crowds will be back soon, and once they are, I think it's going to make for a lot of opportunities for these, feds to maybe break out and possibly, wrest control of the industry away from the WWE, which, in my opinion, is all for the best.
That's the exciting thing about AEW, working with Impact and working with New Japan and working with the NWA. They all, and it's not the
kind of feels like the territories again, in a way.
Working together. And they tried that, but it didn't work in '85 because there were too many egos. There was Bill Watts, Jerry Jarrett, Vern Gagne, Jim Crockett. But these guys are all the same mindset. They know that they can help each other, AEW being, the big cheese, and these other ones, NWA, Impact, well, not New Japan. New Japan's on another level. But Impact... But
their presence in the United States isn't as big. So...
Well, it was on par, but then the pandemic hit, and they lost Access TV. But they on Roku every week has the New Japan shows, I believe, from their Santa Monica. It's an Americanized show. You really should be watching that. And then there's wrestling every night of the week. And then, of course, there's all kinds of lucha on weekends, Lucha Azteca, and those are older CMLL matches and regular. So as I said before, just check out your Hispanic stations. There's at least one wrestling show on Saturday, one on Sunday. And anyway, buddy, I've got to get going.
I appreciate your input this week. It's been great. Hopefully we can have you again in a few, a couple more weeks where you can throw in a few more guests that I know you've been working on booking, and
I've been working
forward to that too.
Candy Divine, and I'm trying for some surprises like Bob Backlund and either one or both Bushwhacker, Sheep Herders, Butch and Luke, and then some promoters and APW originals. So I'm going to keep
send them all this way. We love to have them as guests, and we always love having you as a guest on our show. That's it for this week, everybody, and we'll see you again real soon, Mike. Thanks for being on the show.
Combate Kurosai.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.